Recording now.
That's okay? Okay. So welcome everybody. I'm glad to be contributing in this small way to having an in-person event here at HNC, and also that people from Washington and Bologna and elsewhere can attend virtually. I think for all of the challenges of the pandemic, this kind of intellectual community for hybrid events is quite a breakthrough, and one that we expect to continue in the coming months. I should also note that I think there are a few guests who attended the panel back on February 20th that we co-hosted with the Simone Weil Center. That was also dealing with issues around the pandemic. And even though this is not formally part of the same series, we will be having some other related events in coming months. I think when you see the title of the talk, you might imagine that anyone speaking about this, whether in the West or China or elsewhere, would be likely to be talking within certain common frames, the kind of stuff that you see in the headlines over the last year. They might talk about which country has done well or badly in handling the pandemic. They might talk about Trump's idiosyncrasies, about the lack of social solidarity and how health systems got hollowed out for many years and then collapsed. They might talk about individualism and lack of social discipline in the West and how tight lockdowns in China and New Zealand worked better. Or if they have opposite views, they might be talking about a loss of freedom and how busybodies and snowflakes overreacted in a kind of mass panic to a disease that they think doesn't really harm many people, and that this is just another sign of how soft people are becoming. I mention these common frames at the outset because I'm not going to cover the topic in those familiar terms. I think the most interesting aspect of what's been happening is not the performance of different systems. I think what's far more important or more interesting is what's been happening beneath the surface, how certain self-understandings have been evolving and how certain changes in political culture lie beneath the quite strong feelings that people have about the pandemic and responses to it. And I think to understand this better, it would help to imagine the perspective of someone from another era, say from 100 or 200 years ago, if they were plopped down in the middle of any Western society in the middle of the pandemic. And I think the things they would notice would be quite revealing about the nature of late modernity. Mostly what I'm going to say is about the West and what's changed over time from past to present, but in the end, I'll note that the insights do extend much farther afield horizontally to other parts of the world, including China. So I should say at the outset what perspective I'm coming from with this approach. I'm not offering an empirical study here, right? I haven't done surveys about what people think or anything like that. What I'm offering instead is some general observations, and I'm trying to connect them to some old themes in political thought. During the pandemic, I've spent time in 4 different Western countries, in the UK, Spain, the US, Italy, as well as here in China. So I've seen various types and levels of pandemic response and the way that diverse people have reacted to them. And since this is a polarizing issue for many people, I'll also say quite frankly that on a personal level, I've been quite ambivalent about a lot of the details of the responses. So on the one hand, I've found certain measures, including, as I think many people at HNC will have experienced themselves, a lot of restrictions on movement, restrictions on travel being perhaps too heavy-handed or ill thought out. On the other hand, I've often been quite astounded by how lax many people are in managing risk. There are times on the one hand when I've thought that some restrictions are simply reflecting political or bureaucratic imperatives. But on a personal level, for most of the pandemic, I actually had quite OCD habits, even washing the food shopping with soap and being quite paranoid about touching surfaces. A few days ago, somebody here at HNC noticed that I don't open doors with a hand, I use my elbow instead. So I have been quite paranoid about the real risks of getting COVID, passing it on to family members, and so on. So to be quite frank, I think I am more concerned about the implications for liberty of a lot of what's been happening, but I'm also not one of the people who downplays the real risks of COVID and the need to mitigate them with policy measures which are proportionate and well targeted. I think those of you who may be familiar with my books and other writings will know that I am pretty deeply critical of liberal modernity in general. So it won't surprise you that I see the pandemic as a lens into some disconcerting trends in attitudes towards state and society and human psychology. Both the proponents of tight lockdowns and other restrictions on the one hand, and those who have been most resistant to restrictions, have, I will argue, some peculiarly modern and narrow ideas about human flourishing. And I think this is yet another instance showing how far the thinning out of civilization has gone in the last couple of generations. We have power going. Hang on. So by the thinning of civilization, I mean there's a kind of vast landscape of human meanings and landscape of society that's been given short shrift in late modernity in general and in the pandemic era in particular. And I think that in many ways this bodes ill for the future. I said at the outset that a useful question, I think, is to ask what somebody from another era, 100 or 200 years ago, would notice about the pandemic if they were dropped into the middle of it. And I think some things they would recognize and would find perfectly normal. The fact of the pandemic itself would be pretty familiar. We've always had plagues, epidemics, many much, much worse than what we've been going through recently. I think they also find it quite familiar for the state to have a role in public health and to take some measures to limit the spread of contagion during an epidemic. The idea of quarantine, for example, goes back to Venice in the 14th century. And even in pre-modern times with limited state capacity, I think it was widely accepted that some use of state power in an epidemic did fall within the state's narrow sphere of responsibility for public safety. At the same time, in those earlier eras, the vast majority of things that human beings did to cope with disease happened in society, right, with the daily efforts of hundreds of millions of people. Whether we're talking about the 1918 flu or 1957 or 68 flu pandemics, which were pretty bad at the time, but people seem to have forgotten them since, or the ongoing efforts to fight everything from measles to tuberculosis to smallpox. All of the practices and norms about isolating patients or disinfecting or burning contaminated objects and so on, the predominance of energy in doing that was in households and institutions. It was not in common state regulation for the whole of society. What the COVID pandemic has seen in contrast to that is what I think any observer dropped from the past into the middle of it would find most noticeable, and that is that the state has taken the lead. We've seen tight regulation of movement in ways that we have not seen since World War II. We see a minute regulation of all aspects of human behavior in a way that really has no precedent in any context. State regulation has a much bigger role than personal responsibility, and the way that people have passively adjusted behavior to these state edicts has been quite remarkable. I remember late spring and early summer of last year when I was in England. For quite a while, I used to wear masks going into supermarkets, and for quite a long time, I noticed there were maybe 3 other people in the shop, typically, who would actually be wearing masks whenever I went in there. And then around, I think, late June or early July, the law suddenly changed. Everyone had to wear masks, and you see masks on everyone in the shops. But at the same time, I really noticed people's personal habits, how they were touching their credit cards and keys and phones and faces and everything else, did not change one iota despite this mass imposition of a new rule for masks. Apart from the state regulation of behavior, I think the observer from another era would also notice the expanded view of the state's responsibility for pandemic outcomes in general. Not just for taking specific public health measures that states and other eras might have taken within their narrow range of responsibility, but I think what's really striking is the extent to which politicians are actually being seen as responsible for overall death certificates, numbers of patients in hospital. We see the media, the headlines, screaming mortality numbers. Politicians urge people to stay at home as a kind of civic duty so they don't overburden the public health system, and so on. This vast expansion in the scope of state responsibility, I think, would strike any observer as very, very odd in long-term perspective. And this is something, the beginnings of which were noted by the philosopher Hannah Arendt in the 1950s when she used the term national housekeeping. And she used this term to refer to the fact that in the post-war period, modern states in the West took over responsibility for a whole range of economic management, social problems, etc., a kind of housekeeping beyond the narrow responsibilities for security, justice, and certain specific public goods that was seen as within the state's duties before. Now, to the advocates of tight lockdowns and other restrictions, this deployment of state power on behalf of the common good is quite a natural and desirable thing. It builds on assumptions that accumulated over the 20th century. And this is not just a question of state capacity. It's not that states now have tools to do things, and if those tools had existed before, then people clearly would have wanted the state to do those things before. It's also a deeper change in values and attitudes. It's the primacy of physical health as one of the most common types of security that it's now believed should be guaranteed to all citizens. So we see this convergence of certain priorities, a certain sense of urgency, certain ideas about political solidarity, and the capacity, the mechanisms to bring all of this together that lined up to favor the sort of state intervention in society that we've witnessed over the last 16 months. Now, an observer from another era, I think, would be pretty astounded by the scope of these measures. He or she may or may not have supported them. That's open to question. But I think this person would also notice on the other side the resistance and the kinds of counter-arguments against tight pandemic response measures. And I think the thing this person would be most struck by is that whereas in a more traditional society, you have a wide range of pursuits and commitments and the whole complex tapestry of traditional life. Nowadays, for people who were resisting these measures, you actually see a surprisingly narrow range of counter-arguments as to why those restrictions were a bad idea. So if you look at the policy arguments against lockdown, masking, travel restrictions, those kinds of things, typically the arguments for leaving life as unrestricted as possible hinged on the economy, right? The idea that a higher number of deaths is acceptable if economic growth and employment levels don't suffer as a result. And there was one fairly extreme case that got some media attention. Dan Patrick, whose picture is there, he was the Lieutenant Governor of Texas. Last April, he said, quote, "There are more important things than living." And he then went on to explain that he thought older and vulnerable people should be willing to risk dying to avoid, in his words, crushing the economy. In the same way, you can also see that a lot of the exceptions from restrictions are easiest to defend on economic grounds, whether it's letting so-called essential workers go to work, or one of the strongest arguments or most frequent arguments we hear against travel restrictions is that it's killing the airline and hospitality, hotel, travel sectors, right? Looking at the economic effects of restrictions. You can also see at the level of individual waivers to exemptions, right? If you have a strong economic reason to engage in a certain activity, whether it's travel or something like that, you're more likely to fall under various exceptions. So you've actually seen this strange kind of tension or tug of war over the last year and a half between Homo medicus and Homo economicus, right? So just as the health statistics are the very narrow yardstick being used by those who are advocating tight lockdowns, economic statistics are an equally narrow yardstick for those who call for a looser approach. And in some ways, this kind of debate where you have these narrowly measurable standards of human well-being is pretty natural when you have high state capacity, you have technocratic policymakers who have so much control over these decisions. It's perhaps natural that this would happen. And the exception, in a way, proves the rule. There was a time last year when some people were looking at Sweden as an alternative model. And they said, well, in Sweden, they're not really restricting very much, and they're talking more about personal responsibility. But if you dig a bit more deeply into the reasons that were given by the Swedish government and public health authorities, it was the same kind of argument in a way. Basically, they said, well, if you lock down too tightly, it's actually going to generate worse health problems for people. It's going to create an economic impact that will then make it harder to support the public health budget in the future. Right? So even the exception was not really about personal responsibility or society. It was more about a better way of getting at these narrowly measured goods of economics and health. Now, these examples are, I think, pretty narrow reasons involving policy debates, right? Weighing the economy against health statistics. But there's also a kind of strange narrowness that I think this observer from the past would notice about the rage, the fury of ordinary people, that segment of the population that has been most vocal about resisting lockdowns, masks, and vaccination. And we do see some people who grumble about things like not being able to go to religious services or see family members, and that kind of curtailing of social ties is something that I'll come back to later. But the loudest resistance, the people who have got the most attention and made the most noise, is actually around not wanting to be physically constrained by authority, right? Not wanting to be held in what they see as a kind of animalistic captivity. And I think this is where a lot of the energy, where a lot of the visceral dislike of things like masks on faces and shots in arms comes from. And the sensibility of this sort of populist resistance is that these physical impositions are coming from above. They're coming from a state bureaucracy that is staffed by a stratum of sort of do-gooding center-left experts who, discontented populists already feel in normal times before the pandemic were fettering them in other aspects of life. Right? This is seen as yet another or more extreme example of what people were already discontented about. And one, I think, useful illustration of this is if you look at some of the social correlations, right? What kinds of people were most resistant to mask wearing. There have actually been studies done both in the US and the UK, which found that the demographic that was least likely to be willing to wear masks were middle-aged, male, working class, from rural or economically deprived areas with lower education levels, and typically people who had been more likely to vote for Trump or for Brexit. Now, if you think of sort of caricatured archetypes here, you have a kind of contrast between on the one hand, the sort of health and safety conscious enthusiasts of enlightened policymaking about everything from tobacco usage to energy sustainability to political correctness. And from the standpoint of these populist critics, these kinds of controls, right, whether it's in ordinary life before the pandemic or in masks on faces and shots in arms, they reek of a future of technocratic captivity and seem to curtail the fun of masculine self-assertion and robust appetite. So this response and the intensity of feeling, I think, occurs against this backdrop of cultural sensibilities. But this is, I think, where things get quite interesting, because it's not just a culture war or clashing psychologies. The narrowness of the debate itself is, I think, odd by any long-term historical standards, because you get a lot of attention to health and money and physical autonomy, but you don't get as much attention to things like society or meaning or the spiritual dimension of human well-being. It's also interesting because if you dig a little deeper into this, you find that these two sides actually have quite a lot of common assumptions, even though they'd never admit it. And these common assumptions are symptomatic of a more far-reaching shift in modern culture and attitudes. Both, on the one hand, the forces pushing for a strict response to the pandemic, and the forces who are pushing for doing as little as possible, they converge on a narrowly physicalist and atomistic view of human flourishing. And this, I think, is what would seem most alien to this observer from another era if he or she spent a few days in a Western society in the middle of the pandemic. So what do I mean by a physicalist, atomistic view of human flourishing and liberty? One idea that's not entirely new is that modernity has put the physical body at the center of self-understanding. And we've seen people making this kind of cultural observation for quite a few decades. If you go back to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, you see emerging the modern idea that sexuality is the core of human self-expression. You see what Christopher Lasch called the culture of narcissism. Right? Among the baby boomer generation, the idea emerged that preserving physical youth for as long as possible was a kind of obsession. You see the so-called expressive individualism, the idea that you see the meaning of the world as something that people individually construct from the inside out, right? The meaning you assign to the world comes from your own subjective tastes and predilections. So in all of these examples, this kind of self-understanding casts off many of the traditional constraints that modern people tend to think would impede a more natural expression of physical needs. As Michel Foucault put it, the soul is the prison of the body. In other words, the body is constrained by external traditional demands that one's soul should be ordered to certain transcendent standards. Now, the centrality of this kind of physical subjecthood and physical experience and self-expression actually unites both sides of the pandemic divide. On the left, you have those who favor strict lockdowns and paying any price to minimize deaths, maybe even a zero COVID or total eradication strategy, which some on the left appear to favor because they believe that physical health and survival is the foundation for all other social goods. They believe in what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben said, I think last March, was so-called bare life, right? In other words, physical life for its own sake, regardless of what else you're sacrificing to maintain it. And this has some strange implications, even some sinister implications, because we saw early in the pandemic in March 2020, when in Italy, the hospitals had to engage in triage calculations when the ventilators ran out. And the medical establishment basically fell back on age rationing. At one point, they denied ventilators to anyone over the age of 60. And the ethical rationale was that they needed to assure a minimal equality of lifespan. In other words, the idea that the chief moral interest that any human being would have would be in remaining alive as a biological entity experiencing the world for a certain duration of time. Now, on the opposite side, the preoccupations about resistance coming from the populist right, they also center on the body. Right? They center on a kind of bodily autonomy against the imposition of wearing masks, compulsory vaccinations, and some of the longer term fears that many critics have, that eventually human beings will be microchipped so that the technocrats can intrude more deeply into the body itself. So the kind of physical autonomy that the resistance imagines is different from that of lockdown proponents who are interested in bare life for its own sake. What you see among the populist resistance instead is this image of a kind of robustly healthy, economically active agent, right? And this kind of person, he sees himself as the core of a free, energetic, functioning society, that he doesn't owe much to anyone else, is not vulnerable enough to demand much of anyone else, right? And this idea distinguishes between that kind of healthy, mainstream, economically active type of person on the one hand, and the elderly and vulnerable and marginal on the other. And the logic of having no or few restrictions is that you leave the physical and economic agency of the mainstream unfettered, and then marginal demographics, they're either worth sacrificing or you shield them in some way and impose the cost of isolation on them for as long as necessary. And I use the term he in describing how this kind of person thinks, because there is a kind of a masculine undertone to this sort of physical self-assertion. You sense that a lot of the loudest opponents of lockdown and masking, they see themselves as the hardy, courageous core of society. And I think they imagine that if there were a war, they would happily go off and fight in the war, but in the meantime, the best they can do is be assertive by going about normal life in the middle of a pandemic because they won't be controlled. That was that slide. So this sort of physicalist understanding of human flourishing and freedom, whether it's bare life on the left or this kind of hardy, robust Homo economicus on the right, is monistic. Right? It has one dimension in the sense that it reduces experience and commitment to one fairly narrow aspect. And it's atomistic in the sense that the goods that are being defended are experienced by the individual who is unencumbered, right? The individual who has all of these kinds of social meanings and another sense of belonging stripped away. So on the one hand, you have this embodied human being who stays conscious, clocking up her life expectancy, or on the other side, you have this kind of robust agent who goes about daily movement and money making and so on unfettered because he can withstand what is only a mild flu after all. Now, I won't say that our observer from another era would think all of these lines of thinking are completely unrecognizable. I think many a person before modern times probably wanted to live to an old age in good health and might take some pride in being hardy enough to survive disease. But I think that that kind of observer would at least find that these preoccupations are rather swollen compared to things that might have mattered more to most people in the distant past. At the same time, though, this is not really an entirely new understanding because in some sense, it always existed. Right? It has not just come out of a modern liberal society. I think there are some forerunners, even though they were fairly marginal, right? They weren't in the cultural mainstream. And one surprising, even sort of counterintuitive comparison is that it actually aligns with a lot of ancient thinking about why slavery was such an indignity. There's a historian named Orlando Patterson who wrote a classic work on how the ancients in Greece and Rome and some other places understood slavery. Right? And he argued that the common cultural understanding of slavery at the time was that the enslaved person's identity was a terrible kind of social death. In other words, unlike most free people whose identities had very complicated ideas of membership and status and honor and so on, the slave was merely physically alive, right? The slave was alienated from social ties and status, both the dignity and the constraints of social ties and status. The slave had no connection with the past or the future. The slave was simply carrying out physical labor and could actually cross social spaces and boundaries because the slave was not recognized as anything more than a physical body. The slave was not treated or seen as a social or spiritual being. And to the ancient mind, this is exactly what was so terrifyingly undignified and inhuman about the ancient slave's existence. And that's why, according to Orlando Patterson and according to many political thinkers from that era, any honorable person, if they were given the choice between surviving as a slave versus dying, would think the dying was far better, right? That social and spiritual death was the worst thing that could happen to one. Now, I realize that putting it this way or drawing this comparison is probably going to provoke, but if you think of all the ways that the individual in late modernity is a lot less encumbered by ideas of status and honor and social roles and boundaries and meanings. If you think about how physical health and survival and material gain have become proportionately more important so that there is, in a sense, less worth dying for. In short, a key part of the modern self-understanding behind both sides of the pandemic response, both the physical self-assertion of the populist right and the bare life of the pro-lockdown left, a key part of that self-understanding, even though they think they're defending human freedom and dignity in their own ways, actually overlaps with the gloomy and alienated image of the socially dead ancient slave who was alive as a mere physical agent. Now, how true this is, whether one agrees with it or not, I think is open to debate. But if it is true, if this kind of self-understanding that used to be pretty marginal has become so central, such an unconscious part of late modern society, then we have to ask the important question, how did this happen? Right? Why has the public conversation and the range of goods got thinned down to this physical bedrock? Now, I don't think there's any one factor. And I think of all the factors, some may be more important or more problematic than others. One obvious, pretty easy answer is that people care a lot more about physical health because they can, right? The knowledge and resources to live a long time in relatively good health have developed in the modern era. You can care a lot more about health and safety because it's actually easier to be healthier and safer than before. But this pull towards physicality is only one side of it. I think there's also a push towards physicality because, to put it in a different way, a lot of the full range of traditional satisfactions, things that gave meaning to life, have actually shrunk quite a lot with the atomization of society and the emptying out of all the sources of meaning. So I don't want to overstate it, but to the extent that we see this modern secular world, there is a lot less to pull people out of a digitalized, consuming, money-making self. So physical survival and self-assertion come to occupy quite a lot of ground by default. People want to live as long and as unfettered a life as possible because, in a sense, there is less worth dying for and less that it's worth paying the price of a kind of self-command to achieve. So this kind of one-dimensional monistic mental shrinkage is also paralleled by a monistic social shrinkage. You see the landscape of civil society and social structure weakening. So all of the traditional bulwarks that used to exist between an overbearing managerial state and this mass of atomized individual subjects have actually weakened quite a bit over the last couple of generations. If you had a more differentiated, stronger traditional society, the state's capacity to impose lockdowns would have been much more limited. When a plurality of ends and a plurality of sources of social power have both shrunk, you end up with a physical self that is kept alive for its own good, or that lashes out against being physically constrained. So what we're seeing is a kind of collapse in two senses. A collapse in the sense of a narrowing of range, and a collapse in the sense of a destruction. And it's going to sound quite curmudgeonly to put it this way, but in a way, the pandemic is illustrating the modern collapse of civilization. So far, what I've described is mainly in that single axis between a certain kind of high capacity state at one end and a certain kind of individual self-understanding at the other. And in different Western countries, these priorities, these pools have worked out in different ways, right? There's been a balance in some places more towards health and lockdown, say in Australia and New Zealand. In other places like the United States, we've seen more of an emphasis on economic numbers and pretty much letting the pandemic rip. But the ideas, the social forces, and this kind of tug of war going on has been, I think, pretty recognizable in most countries, even if the balance between them and the policy outcomes may have varied from case to case. The final thing I want to consider is another aspect of the pandemic response and how it relates to this self-understanding, and that's the nation state and travel restrictions. One thing that we've seen in many, probably most countries in the world is restrictions on cross-border movement. Many countries have denied entry to non-citizens and non-residents, and in some ways, restrictions on movement are a kind of familiar tool. An observer from another era would recognize that often the state did restrict movement of people during an epidemic to reduce the spread of contagion. They may wonder at the extent and the unevenness and the logic of some of these restrictions, but the mere fact of restricting movement sometimes would not be that unfamiliar. But if you look a bit further into this, any restriction on cross-border movement is also affirming the state as a territorial community with a population within it that is being protected by the state. And this is where these self-understandings again come into play, these aspects of political culture. One thing that is pretty striking is how little pushback there has been against many of these cross-border restrictions on movement. Despite the extent of globalization and migration and the immense flows of people across countries before the pandemic, it's pretty remarkable how little pushback there has been once borders close. And I think the reason for this is because both versions of this modern self-understanding actually don't provide very strong language for why the state should not be doing this except in exceptional cases. So let's look separately at both sides of the debate here. So on the one hand, you have the sort of populist right, the people who have been bridling at restrictions in daily life, people who see freedom and flourishing in terms of individual bodily autonomy, of a kind of assertive and masculine economic agent. And these are people who feel quite constrained by technocratic states and the educated classes. So you might think that they would think of international travel restrictions as yet another limit on personal autonomy. But in practice, they don't make very much fuss about those restrictions at all. And that's because even before the pandemic, a lot of their lashing out against the modern establishment was being done in populist terms, being done as citizens belonging to the mainstream of a sovereign state who were lashing out against foreigners. Indeed, even though a lot of traditional life, a lot of the traditional kinds of commitments and circuits of belonging have collapsed for this popular demographic, the one touchstone of identity, the one political tool they are quite eager to use to lash out is membership in the political community, membership in the demos as a citizen who can go to the ballot box, lash out against outsiders, lash out against those they see as effete minorities outside a national mainstream over which they want to reclaim ownership. This is why, for the populist right, there seems to be no tension in their mind between, on the one hand, telling the state to keep masks off their own faces, while rejoicing over things like Brexit and quarantining South Asian travelers in hotels at Heathrow Airport, and celebrating the early Trump travel ban on China when the pandemic started. So from their perspective, when the state constrains outsiders, that's fine, because that affirms their own membership and their own power based on that membership in a national community. And if the cross-border circuits of social life get severed in the process, that simply doesn't matter as much as the distinction between insiders and outsiders. And we also see some analogies here in the political culture of the so-called alt-right. Right? As some critics have pointed out, the alt-right is not defending Christendom and European civilization or any complex tradition. Right? They're usually marking off a kind of pagan-style collectivity where the only markers are physical attributes of white masculinity that is lashing out violently. This, again, is a kind of physicalist self-understanding. Right? Once all the complex layers of meaning, virtue, and engagement in a traditional civilization have collapsed, we see a lot less self-command and a lot more raw self-assertion and expression of physical appetites. So that's one side of it. But what about the left? What about the left and travel restrictions? In some ways, this is a more interesting paradox because while you might expect the populist right to be selective and have a double standard about its own liberties versus outsiders' liberties, if anyone had predicted in 2019, before the pandemic, that it would actually be left-leaning Western politicians and segments of public opinion that would be most supportive of travel restrictions, I think we would have been very surprised 2 years ago to hear that. After all, the left has generally been in favor of immigration and freer movement and suspicious of national sovereignty. But what have we seen over the last year? We've seen heroines of the left like New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern or Scotland's Nicola Sturgeon implementing or at least advocating highly restrictive border regimes for a long time to come, even a kind of permanent zero COVID fantasy. And they actually quite admire the pull up the drawbridge policies that we see in Australia, China, and elsewhere. So this doesn't look like a very natural agenda for the left suddenly to want to close off the national community. But if we see it in the context of these self-understandings that I've traced about human flourishing and freedom and the deployment of state authority, it actually becomes a little less surprising. The left has most been against travel restrictions during the pandemic in a couple of situations. They were dead against it early on when the pandemic was starting in China because they saw travel restrictions as a kind of quasi-racist or xenophobic lashing out against a non-Western part of the world. Some of the instances where the left has been most critical of certain travel restrictions are actually quite revealing. A few weeks ago, when Australia, concerned about the Indian variant, even banned its own citizens from coming back from India, some on the left criticized this and said, well, this is inherently a racist policy because most Australian nationals who are trying to return to Australia from India are actually of Indian ethnic origin, and this smacks of racist undertones. So if you dig into this logic a bit deeper, you can actually see that from the left's perspective, one of the key gains of immigration and diversity is that immigrants, by their very presence in a society, disrupt and thwart the older national mainstream's self-assertion as a political majority. So in that sense, a kind of embodied immigrant diversity is actually a claim about what the common ground of the political community cannot be. At the same time, from the left's perspective, the ability to exert state power for socially reformist ends is equally or maybe even more crucial. And we see, not only in the pandemic, but other instances, that the left gets a lot less enthusiastic about cross-border movement when it stands in the way of the primacy of state over society and invoking a kind of closed national solidarity to shore up the primacy of state over society. So even before the pandemic, we've seen in recent years some leftist political parties taking a growing interest in controls on cross-border movement of capital, right, to maintain or enhance the state's control over the economy. So in the pandemic, the idea of a strong state running society like a hospital ward may very well require closing down cross-border movement of people. So there's a kind of paradox that the left wants a diverse community, wants a diverse demos, but it doesn't necessarily care as much about having a demos that is really transnationally connected and mobile. Mobility sometimes looks more like a means to a transformed end state and less an ongoing human liberty in itself. So there's a kind of common ground between the xenophobic populists on the right and the zero COVID nanny staters on the left. In their own ways, they're both quite comfortable deploying the machinery of the territorial state against cross-border society. The different foreigner and the contagious foreigner are, in a sense, both being kept out. Both are very statist mentalities, because when it really comes down to it, any restriction on cross-border movement in the name of a territorial state is inherently siding with the state against society. It's inherently opting for a monistic, one-dimensional view of human well-being over the plural engagements that can't be fully captured by health, economy, and safety. And this kind of restriction on cross-border movement is in the same spirit as how, during the pandemic, even within countries, so many of these decisions have empowered state over society and have involved the state picking and choosing which activities in society are worthwhile and to what extent they should be either restricted or prioritized. Now, our observer from the past looking at all of this would not, as I said, deny any state authority targeted to public health. As I pointed out, quarantine measures and the like were familiar tools through history. And I should emphasize that nothing that I've said so far actually rules out taking public health measures to reduce the density of interaction with people, to reduce the onward infection rate, maybe to reduce the transfer of infection from places with a high rate of infection to a low rate of infection, and so on. Right? You can have a limited, targeted view of legitimate state power and still have quite a lot of tools available for dealing with legitimate public health concerns. But if you take the claims of society seriously, you would not give the benefit of the doubt to the state just because it is invoking health. You would be very wary, for example, of the state going beyond simple epidemiological considerations, things like density of interaction, infection rates, etc., going into which activities are actually worthwhile, which are essential, which are not. Right? It's when the state gets into that detail, that level of society, right? When it goes beyond being blind to the different dimensions of human activity and only looking at health and infection rates and so on, that's where the risk to liberty and pluralism really arise. And I think what our observer from another era would find most unsettling is how far the state is stepping into society and overriding down to this atomized subject who is being kept alive for the sake of being alive. An observer from the past would probably be astonished with both sides of this. You'd be astonished with, on the one side, any society putting up, for example, with prioritizing business while insisting that religious services should be suspended, family visits should not be allowed, or a dying patient should not be allowed to have bedside visitors, or any number of other things which make life more worthwhile than the physical survival of the slave. At the same time, this observer would probably also be quite bewildered by some of the resistance to things like wearing a mask or vaccination, if those measures would actually enable those other meaningful circuits of life to continue functioning as far as practical. So the anti-maskers would actually look like practitioners of petulance rather than people with the kind of virtuous self-command that sustained the liberties of traditional societies. Now, this is a pretty dark picture, and I'm sure that a lot of what I've said will seem uncomfortable because it does indict pretty broad swaths of the modern Western political spectrum. It also suggests that the problem is how people understand themselves, and it goes to how these self-understandings imply some pretty important things for political culture and the concentration of power. But if the pandemic, what happens if we shift the comparison? If we don't just look at the West's past and the West's present, if we think about the situation in the West versus the rest of the world, what do we get to? Because on the one hand, this is a Western story or a Western tragedy in a sense, because pluralism used to be the core strength of Western civilization. And by pluralism, I mean the fragmentation of power, the idea of the state not being sovereign across all aspects of society, the diverse tapestry of callings and priorities and reservoirs of social power outside the state, and all the individual virtues that used to be cultivated in those social spaces. Pluralism was not unique to the West, but the West did put a great emphasis on it and was very conscious of it. So if the West has moved from pluralism to monism, by the health of the economy, then you might actually say that the West is losing its soul even as the body lives on. It's much like the ancient slave nightmare of mere physical survival after experiencing a social and spiritual death. And these risks to liberty are likely to intensify. Perhaps the pandemic has merely revealed what people actually value. Maybe it's revealed what unsettles people, and perhaps most ominously, what most people are collectively willing to put up with. And if you think of change over generations, it doesn't look very likely that things are going to improve much. You have the baby boomer culture of narcissism and the alienation of Generation X, which got us to this point. But I don't see a lot of signs that millennials and post-millennials really want to recover the kind of society in which there are many things more important than bare physical life or asserting one's appetites. In a broader global perspective, the picture is not necessarily any brighter. A lot of the trends of power elsewhere are certainly not reassuring. The Chinese COVID model in many ways is even more monistic, less expansive in the range of human aspiration than what I've described in the West. Of course, we shouldn't underestimate how within the West there were quite a lot of people who took the health risks seriously and wanted to take responsible precautions, but who also felt that many of the top-down restrictions were out of whack with common sense and caused immense emotional suffering to people in unnecessary ways, including curtailing some very basic human connections. That kind of misgiving in the West perhaps didn't have the same political energy and was not as loud as the anti-mask populism, but there is still a heartening reservoir of claims on behalf of society against the state and against the economy, even though it wasn't very well articulated. So even within the West, there are countervailing currents, even though they may not be very loud. If you look farther afield around the world, if you look beyond the West and beyond China, perhaps there are also some counterweights left in the global South, places like Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, where you do still have more pluralistic social landscapes, higher levels of religiosity, weaker states that can impose themselves less. And in some ways, maybe it's reassuring that those parts of the world are much more likely to grow faster in coming decades than either the West or China. Another perhaps hopeful element is that this modern atomistic self-understanding is deeply unsatisfying. It's deeply alienating even to the people who hold it, right? It's a vacuum. It's not a source of fulfillment. And as the saying goes, nature abhors a vacuum. So human dignity and human imagination are pretty powerful forces. And we found that history in the cycle of eras and civilizations does have a tendency to surprise us, as it were. Okay, so apologies for the technical mishaps earlier on. I'll open up for any questions or discussions if I can figure out how to stop the screen sharing here.